Hello, this is a video for about foundations, kind of an intro video about foundations, so that you understand what a foundation is better as you consider funding from foundations. And I'm going to include in this particular video discussion about corporations that have foundations, because a lot of times that's what you'll do. You'll be applying, if you're looking for money from a corporation, a lot of times you'll be applying to the foundation of a corporation. So I'm kind of covering corporations and foundations with this same video because oftentimes it is a foundation of the corporation that gives the money. I will say, just as an aside, before I get into foundations, you can go to corporations directly, and corporations sometimes give out of their profits directly. Sometimes it's not a foundation. This particularly can happen with local companies, franchises, local stores. A lot of times they will help nonprofits through sponsorships. They might give $500 to, support the Little League baseball team or whatever, help buy the t-shirts. A lot of times companies will give from their materials. So, I know sometimes restaurants will give iced tea for an event or that sort of thing. In-kind giving is what that's called. So I'm not trying to suggest that as nonprofits you would never approach a company directly. In fact, LeTourneau's engineering professors often get materials, and some of the student engineering teams get raw materials from companies free of charge, pipes, wiring, all sorts of stuff for projects that they have going. And that's not about foundations. That's about contacting the companies that have those kind of materials and selling the company on the idea that you're going to use this material for some good service or some good project or that sort of thing. So that kind of thing happens and can happen. But what this video is again about is foundations, and corporations will have foundations. And a lot of times when you go to a website for a corporation and you see that they have a giving program, it's out of their foundation. And so we will talk about that along the way as we talk about foundations. Okay, about foundations. So foundations are a special sort of nonprofit recognized by the IRS. And what makes them special is the way they're organized, and the purpose of their organization means that the IRS is looking for them to give away an average of 5% of their assets each year. So their whole expressed purpose is to give money away, give funds away. And, the foundations can continue to grow because more new money is being added from individuals or from the company or whatever the source of those kind of funds are. Foundations can also continue to grow if their earnings on their assets, they'll have, let's say, $1 million worth of assets or $10 million worth of assets or whatever, and those assets are invested in the stock market and in bonds and in property and all sorts of stuff. So assuming that their investments do well, and assuming the investments earn more than 5%, then the foundation would continue to grow its assets because they're only required to give out 5% of their assets each year. So if they're on average seeing a return on their investments of 6% or 7%, then they would be growing because they're only giving away 5% of that each year. So but the good news is their mission is to give money away. In fact, they've got to give money away. until they decide to divest, until they decide to go away, in which case, if you find a foundation that's about to do that, and it may take a couple of years for them to do that, but if you're on the giving end of a foundation that's going away, they tend to give a lot of money away right at the end because they're trying to go out of business. But until that point, their mission is to stay alive, and their mission is to give away 5% every year. Now, sometimes when we have like 2008 happen, they see a huge decrease in their assets because they're supposed to be giving 5% away, and they didn't even make money. During that year, they lost 25% of their assets because the stock market crashed. So, in the following years, then they can't give as much money away. They'll still give 5%, but they can't give as much money away because they just don't have as much assets to give from. They're not earning as much. And so it's a smaller organization after a big crash like that. But their mission is to give. Now, they don't have to give to you. In fact, some foundations will say on their 990, which is the IRS form that all foundations have to fill out. And 990s are discoverable, so you can find those on GuideStar, which is an online source. You can find the 990 and you can see how much assets it has, and you can see what sorts of things they gave to that year, and that sort of thing. But you'll also find on the 990 where they say they only give to predetermined organizations. So if and that can happen. A foundation, has two or three ministries or two or three things it likes to give to every year, and it's not looking for new things to give to. And so no unsolicited requests, it'll often say, because they make those decisions in-house. The trustees decide, hey, I want to be nice to this organization or that organization. And so they're making those decisions, and, unless you're invited to participate, it's not going to come to you. But they do have to give it away, and they have to give it away to somebody. And so that's the good news. You're not asking an organization to give you money that doesn't give money. That's what their job is to give money. So foundations are special in that way. Foundations can be tiny. I've actually known foundations that were managed by a husband and wife that were in their 70s, and they would do that around the kitchen table, and the foundation literally had like $300 a year because that's what they would put into it. And it wasn't so much a matter of they were only going to give 5% of their money each year. They actually probably gave it all away every year. So they might have given away $300 every year, and then they'd put more into the foundation. But anyway, foundations can be tiny, tiny, tiny like that, or foundations can be like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. They can be as small as a little family group that sits around the table. They can be huge and require, all sorts of staff to manage, and can have, a single interest area or multiple interest areas, things they like to give to. So they can be very different in that way. And foundationsearch.com, which is an online subscription that LeTourneau University has, it does cost quite a bit of money, but they track more than 120,000 foundations in the U.S. There are lots of foundations. Longview has a number of foundations, none really big, but they do have a number. So you can find foundations lots of different places geographically, and that's a good thing. And often, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, but a lot of times foundations will give geographically. They will give where they are. And so it's good to know who the foundations are where you are or where your nonprofit is, because those might be more inclined to give to you than others. Okay, there are different types of foundation. And by the way, I'm kind of following the PowerPoint on foundations, but throwing in a whole lot of extra comments. And so if you wanted to look at the PowerPoint in week 1 on foundations, I'm kind of following that. But there are different types of foundations. There are private foundations. Those include independent foundations, which have, they have a board of trustees, and they have kind of interest areas, usually based on the founder, what they wanted the foundation to give to. The founder may not even be alive anymore, but they often kind of give in accordance with the wishes of the foundation, although that can evolve over time and sometimes does. There can be corporate sponsored foundations, and those are companies that set up foundations in order to give, and they might have interests that are related to their organization or that sort of thing. And then there are operating foundations. If you happen to see an operating foundation and you're not part of the organization that they were created for, then you're pretty much out of luck. They're not going to give to you. So, for instance, the symphony may have the symphony in your area may have a symphony foundation, or the hospital may have a hospital foundation. Well, that foundation's not raising money to give away to organizations outside the hospital or outside the symphony. They're raising money for the symphony. They're raising money for the hospital. So operating foundations are not inclined to give to you unless you're the hospital or unless you're the symphony that the foundation was set up to give to. So if you come across those, don't waste your time. But independent foundations and corporate sponsored foundations, those could be good depending on what their interest areas were, what their geographic requirements were, those sorts of things. They could be good. Operating foundations, not so much, unless you are the organization they were set up for. So those are the private foundations. Then there are public foundations. Public foundations are otherwise known as community foundations, and they operate differently. And I'm not saying you shouldn't approach them. You should approach them, because if community foundations and the people that work there know about your organization, they might steer donors to give to your organizations. A lot of the money in community foundations was put there by wealthy people in the community, in that community. And the community foundation's mission or mandate is to give funds to nonprofits in the area, in the community. And so, and there is an East Texas Community Foundation in Tyler, for instance, and its mandate is not just to give to Tyler. Its area includes Longview, it includes much of East Texas. So while a lot of the funds end up going to organizations in Tyler, it's also safe to say a lot of the money comes from people who are wealthy who live in Tyler. And a lot of times what people will do is they will create within the community foundation a donor-directed fund. Now, this is a way for people with wealth to kind of get the tax benefit from giving their money away, but also have the ability to sort of direct where that money goes. And so they'll create a fund within the community foundation. Maybe they have $200,000 in it or whatever. And then there's a small group of people, including the donors to the fund, who get to decide every year where money should go from that fund. Any rate, so the point is, if community foundations do know about you and the good work that you're doing in your nonprofit, then they can advise someone that comes in and says, hey, I really want to give to some sort of women's ministry. Do you know of any good women's ministries? And the community foundation knows about you. They can go, well, hey, guess what? Here's this Fresh Start women's community ministry. down the street here, and they're doing great work, and they need money. So that's a good thing. So get to know your community foundations, and perhaps you can get some money out of them. Sometimes there might be ways to apply for money or ask for grants from them. But a lot of times, and largely, that's not the case. Largely, it's these donor-directed funds making decisions about where they want their money to go every year. So those are the different types. And if you're following the PowerPoint, the next slide is kind of a table of what each type, independent foundations of the private, independent foundations, company-sponsored foundations, and operating foundations are kind of like. The sources of funds for each. For independent foundations, it's typically an individual or family, someone that's made a lot of money in the oil or in agriculture or whatever. They've become fabulously wealthy, and before they died, they established a foundation with some of their wealth because they didn't need it all going to the children. Sometimes, actually, families will create foundations for children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to have to be involved in. So it's not uncommon to find members of the founding family to be trustees of the foundations. And some of those earn some money for their work, and they do work. If they earn too much money, then the IRS starts to question that. You know, you don't want to see, the IRS doesn't want to see a foundation giving a whole lot of money to its trustees and not giving much money away. So that's kind of fraudulent. But the source of funds for independent foundations tend to be individuals and families. Source of funds for community company-sponsored foundation is the for-profit company, like Dollar General or DuPont or whatever, 3M, Kohler. Big companies often have some sort of giving program, and that's usually a foundation. And the money for that foundation comes from the company. Operating foundations also could be, money could come from individuals or the family. Operating foundations are usually always trying to raise money. Again, they're not good candidates to go to get money. They're raising it for their hospital, or they're raising it for their whatever. And so they're often doing things, having events or whatever to raise money. So it's largely individually funded, and I would say not typically like a founding family kind of thing, but more just people are putting money in it. Distribution of grants for independent foundations, 5% or more of the assets are given on average annually. This same thing with company foundations. In terms of the legalities, 5% or more needs to be given. The reality oftentimes with company-related foundations is the company will give a certain amount to the foundation that year. And then the foundation will give most, if not all of that money away that year. And so as the company does well, it gives more to the foundation that year. If the company does less well, it gives less to the foundation that year. So company-sponsored foundations tend not to carry a lot of assets, and they're not worried about return on investments so much as they're worried that the company does well so that the company has profits and can put money into the foundation from the profits. So it's kind of interesting. If you know that the company, if the foundation that year or last year, if you're looking at their 990, you know that the foundation gave away, $200,000, then that means the company probably put $200,000 into the company last year. And operating foundations, the IRS rule on that is the lesser of 85% of the net income or 4.5% of the assets annually, which you probably don't care about since you're not going to be going to them for money. Funding interests can be very, very varied when it comes to independent foundations. Some care about animal rights or animal abuse. Some care about the environment. Some care about legislative issues. Some care about, I mean, it's just the ministry. The sky is the limit. And you have to do your research to know, are you looking at a foundation that cares about the stuff that you're doing? Because they can care about all sorts of things. When it comes to company-sponsored foundations, it's often the foundation cares about things that are sort of related to the company. I mean, the whole mission of a company-sponsored foundation is to help bring good publicity, good PR to the company. And so, you know, I mean, you can imagine a grocery store being concerned about farmers or agricultural needs or, you know, just, I mean, just throwing that out there. It's not always that way, though. I mentioned Dollar General before. Dollar General, for their own personal reasons, probably whoever created Dollar General, has Dollar General's foundation has a real interest in literacy, and they have funds to help with adult literacy, helping adults learn how to read. Youth and children literacy grants are available. And so, you know, you just have to kind of look at what the company's foundation's interests are, because you just never know. And of course, when it comes to operating foundations, they're interested in what they were created for, the hospital, or you get it. When it comes to decision making, independent foundations have a board of trustees. Often includes, you know, the members, donors, or family members of the original donors, and that sort of thing. Company-sponsored foundations have a board of trustees, which is comprised of corporate officers. So the officers on the actual company are also involved in the foundation, making sure that their philanthropic gifts are going to the right place. And operating foundations have a board of trustees. They're all kind of they're nonprofits, and so they would all have a board. And geographic focus, independent foundations can vary. A lot of them are real specific on their geography. Some of them say, you know, a certain group of counties that they're willing to give to. Others might cover a whole state. And then some state that they have no geographic preference and that they will give anywhere. Kind of for me, the proof is in the pudding, because there are foundations that will technically give anywhere, but then when you look at what they've given to in the last 10 years, it's mostly been in their state, a few other gifts in another state, but none in your state. So, you know, to the extent that they don't give in your area, the odds, I would say, are extremely slim that they're going to give to you. Now, if the interest is a great match, and they just you know, are blown away by what you're doing, and they're interested in the stuff that you're interested in and that you're doing, then maybe, you know, maybe they've never given to Texas. You're in Texas with your nonprofit, and they mostly give in Indiana, but they're willing to give around the country. And guess what? You send them a proposal, and they love it, and they give to you. So I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying, when you do your research, when you're looking at the 990s or looking at, you know, other things about where they typically give, and you're not seeing your area in their typical giving, then the odds decrease significantly. So you want to find good matches for your need and for your nonprofit, and that would include a number of things, but among them, kind of chief among them, is, you know, are they willing and do they give in your area? And are they interested in the things that you're doing? And if you can't say yes to both of those things, then I wouldn't spend a lot of time. There might be other things to consider, but those are two big ones. When it comes to company-sponsored foundations, they usually give where the company does business. So, talking about Dollar General again, if there's a Dollar General in your area, then you probably can apply. If you had a literacy interest in literacy, and there's a Dollar General in your area, then you're probably fair game to apply. Look at the website, make sure. But a lot of times they will give where either they do business or where they have contractors. If it's a company that gets a lot of raw materials and then produces something and then sells it. They might give where they sell it, but they also might give in areas where they're harvesting, so to speak, if it's a timber company or whatever. So you just have to look at the websites to see, what geography. And then, of course, operating foundations are going to give to the company, the program that they're supporting. Sorry, whatever the location is. They can give to lots of different things in terms of interest. Some give to education, some give to health, some give to human services, arts and culture, public affairs and society benefits, environment and animals, science and technology, religion, international affairs, social sciences. And let me just say about religion or ministry, depending on what you're doing in terms of service to the community, foundations that don't care anything about religion per se or spiritual matters per se might give to your service project, so long as you were using the money for some humanitarian service purpose and not what they wouldn't want to pay for is for religious conversion kind of thing. So if you had a shelter, a homeless shelter, and part of what you provided to people that came to your homeless shelter was a chapel service before their evening meal. Some foundation might be willing to give you a grant to help cover the cost of the meal, but they may not want to see that you spent any money on bringing in chapel speakers. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying that just because a foundation doesn't express an interest in giving to ministries per se, doesn't mean that they won't give to your project. If you show them the project is not about witnessing or whatever, the project is about meeting human needs like shelter, food, other things. So don't rule out a foundation just because you're religious, if that's what you are. I mean, if that's what the nonprofit is, don't rule out foundations just because you have a ministry. You know, provided that what you're doing fits the interests, the human interests for that foundation. Hope that makes sense. And they can give to different kinds of things. They can give to program support. That's not uncommon. If you have a new program or a certain program that's doing good work, foundations will give to that. Capital support tends to be buildings, bricks and mortar kind of things, and fewer actually foundations are giving to buildings, giving to create buildings. In the past, there have been a number of foundations that's what they were really big into, and a lot of times when you go to college campuses or whatever, you'll see the same name of the same foundation that's given to all sorts of different schools, and so their name ended up on a lot of different buildings around or whatever. But fewer and fewer foundations are actually giving to building projects or bricks and mortar kind of projects. More of them are interested in programs. Sometimes they will be willing to give operating support. That's less. That's less common. But again, if it's a local if it's kind of a local foundation and they really know the nonprofit and they care about the nonprofit and the nonprofit's ongoing success, sometimes they will just give operating expenses, giving straight to the budget, so to speak, to keep the company alive. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of times grants are not so much about the budget, or not so much about the daily operational budget, so much as they are to help fund some novel or new or an improvement on services and that sort of thing. And typically grants are given one time and then the monies are used up. Sometimes grants can be multi-year, where you're expecting 100,000 this year and then 100,000 the next 2 years. But usually, unless you've got a foundation in your area that loves you and gives to you every year, usually it's you're looking at a time limitation, 1 year or 2 or 3. And sometimes foundations will even have rules that you'll read where, if you've gotten money 1 year, then you have to wait a year before you apply again. So you might have money in 2016 and then have to not apply in 2017, and then you can come back to them in 2018. Different foundations have different rules on that, so I'm not trying to say that's universal by any means, but I'm just saying you can't necessarily rely on getting the same dollars from the same foundation year after year after year after year. If it happens, great. That means that foundation really likes you and you're doing good work. Continuing to have that relationship be strong. Good stewardship is what I'm trying to say, but that's uncommon. It's more common that you get a grant, 20,000, 50,000 for some specific purpose. You use the money up, and then the money's gone. So, with regard to that, a lot of foundations will talk about sustainability. They don't mind you giving you money. It may be for some startup, but if it's for startup and you plan this new program to continue, they want to know, what are you thinking about how this program is going to sustain itself once it's up? Because they don't necessarily want you coming back to them year after year after year. So something to consider. Anyway, I think that last slide had student aid. There are some foundations that give scholarships. Those are, you can find them, but it's not the typical foundation that does that. And then some foundations support research and that sort of thing. There's probably more I can say, but that kind of is foundations in a nutshell. I hope this helps.